The rain fell heavily that night, pounding the rusted zinc roof of the small maternity clinic in southwestern Nigeria. Thunder rolled across the sky as if the heavens themselves were uneasy about what was about to happen. Inside the delivery room, the air was thick with tension, sweat, and whispered prayers. Mr. Adebayo paced the narrow corridor, his hands clasped tightly together. His shirt was soaked, not from the rain, but from fear. Every cry that escaped the delivery room cut into his chest like a blade. "Please, God," he whispered again and again, his voice shaking. "Don't take her from me, don't take my wife." A sudden sharp cry pierced the silence, a baby's cry. Hope leapt into his heart. His knees weakened with relief. Moments later, the door creaked open. A nurse stepped out, her face pale, her eyes heavy with sorrow. She held a tiny bundle wrapped in a faded white cloth. The baby was alive, crying, breathing, fighting. But the nurse's silence said everything else. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "Your wife, she didn't make it. The world stopped." Mr. Adebayo felt the ground disappear beneath him. His legs gave way and he slumped against the wall, his breath trapped somewhere between a scream and a sob. He had prepared himself for pain, for struggle, but not for this. Not for losing the woman who had walked beside him through hunger, laughter, and dreams. Inside the room, his wife lay motionless. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Her hand still bore the marks of childbirth, the sacrifice she made so their daughter could live. With trembling hands, Mr. Adebayo took the baby from the nurse. She was so small, so fragile, yet her cries were loud and determined. He stared at her face, his wife's nose, his own eyes, and something inside him broke completely. "She named her already," he whispered, tears streaming freely now. "Tolani," the nurse looked at him gently. "What does it mean?" "Worth more than gold," he replied, his voice cracking. "She said our daughter would be our treasure." He held Tolani close to his chest, feeling the warmth of her tiny body, listening to her heartbeat. In that moment, joy and sorrow collided violently inside him. Life had been given, but at an unbearable cost. As dawn slowly approached, the rain softened. Mr. Adebayo sat alone beside his wife's body, Tolani asleep in his arms. The future stretched before him, dark, uncertain, frightening. He was a man who had just lost his partner, his anchor, the woman who knew how to raise a girl in a world that was not kind. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered to the silent room. "But I promise you, I won't abandon her." Tolani stirred slightly, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb, as if holding him to that promise. And so, on a night marked by grief and birth, Tolani entered the world, not with celebration, but with tears, thunder, and a love already weighed down by loss. The house grew quiet after the burial. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, echoing silence that followed grief, where every corner reminded Mr. Adebayo of what he had lost. The wrappers his wife once wore still hung behind the door. Her slippers remained neatly placed beside the bed, untouched. Even the air seemed to carry her scent, refusing to let go. Tolani was barely 2 weeks old when reality began to set in. Mr. Adebayo returned to work shortly after the burial. Not because he was ready, but because he had no choice. He worked long hours, leaving the house before sunrise and returning after dark. Each morning, he strapped Tolani to his back clumsily, struggling to tie the cloth the way his wife used to. She would cry, and panic would rise in his chest as neighbors peeped in with pity-filled eyes. "Bring her," an elderly neighbor, Mama Said, would often say, taking Tolani for a few hours. "You are a man. This thing is not easy alone." At night, when he returned exhausted, Tolani's cries greeted him like accusations. He would warm water awkwardly, spilling some on the floor, unsure if it was too hot or too cold. Feeding her was worse. She rejected the bottle many times, screaming until both of them were soaked in tears. "I'm sorry," he would whisper helplessly. "I'm trying." As Tolani grew, the absence of a woman in the house became louder. There was no gentle voice singing lullabies, no soft hands braiding hair, no one to teach a little girl how to walk, talk, or pray before sleeping. Mr. Adebayo tried, but love alone could not replace experience. By the time Tolani was 4, she had learned how to entertain herself. She played quietly with stones in the compound, tracing shapes in the sand, humming songs she barely remembered. Other children ran past her, laughing with their mothers, calling them back indoors. "Mummy!" they shouted. The word pierced her every time. One evening, Tolani sat beside her father as he ate. She watched him silently, then asked in a small voice, "Daddy, where is my mummy?" The spoon froze midway to his mouth. He swallowed hard before answering, "She's with God, my dear." Tolani nodded slowly, trying to understand. "Will she come back?" Mr. Adebayo looked away, blinking rapidly. "No." That night he cried after Tolani fell asleep. He noticed how women in the neighborhood looked at his daughter with pity. Some whispered, some advised, "A girl needs a mother. You cannot raise her alone. People will take advantage." Those words settled heavily in his heart. Fear crept in, fear that Tolani would grow up broken, unprotected, and unloved. Fear that his ignorance as a man would fail her in ways he could not yet see. As Tolani turned 6, the gap widened. She began asking questions about her body, about things Mr. Adebayo could not explain comfortably. He avoided the conversations, hoping time would somehow fix everything. But time did not fix anything. It only made the emptiness more obvious. Late one night, after Tolani had fallen asleep with her head on his lap, Mr. Adebayo stared at the ceiling, listening to the crickets outside. "I cannot do this alone," he admitted to the darkness. It was in that moment, filled with exhaustion, guilt, and fear, that the thought of remarriage settled in his mind. Not out of desire, not out of love, but out of desperation. For Tolani. A woman in the house, he believed, would heal the broken spaces. He did not know that this decision, made in weakness and hope, would one day become the doorway to his daughter's greatest suffering. The idea of remarriage did not come suddenly to Mr. Adebayo. It crept into his thoughts slowly, quietly, like a thief in the night, until it became impossible to ignore. Every morning, as he watched Tolani struggle to tie her school uniform or walk to school with uncombed hair, guilt pressed heavily on his chest. He tried his best, but his best never felt enough. Neighbors had begun to talk openly now, no longer whispering behind his back. "A young widower cannot remain alone forever. That child needs a woman's guidance. People will start misbehaving with a girl without a mother." Each comment pierced him differently, planting fear where love once stood strong. One evening, Mr. Adebayo attended a naming ceremony. As he sat quietly at the corner, he watched families interact, mothers feeding children, wiping mouths, scolding gently, laughing freely. Tolani sat beside him, swinging her legs, unusually quiet. "Daddy," she whispered, "Auntie Funky says her mummy helps her with her hair every morning." Mr. Adebayo nodded slowly, unable to respond. That night, sleep refused to come. He sat on the edge of his bed, his wife's photograph resting on his lap. Her smile looked at him gently, almost accusingly. "I'm failing her," he said aloud. "I don't know how to be both father and mother." Tears slipped down his face. He had promised never to replace her, but this was not about replacing love, it was about survival. Days later, he confided in Mama Sade, the elderly neighbor who had helped him since Tolani's birth. "You need a wife," she said plainly. "Not for yourself, but for that child." "What if she hates Tolani?" he asked quietly. Mama Sade sighed. "Life is a risk, my son, but loneliness is also a danger." Those words haunted him. After weeks of prayer, fasting, and inner struggle, Mr. Adebayo finally opened his heart to the idea. He told himself he would be careful, he would choose wisely. He would protect Tolani above all else. He began attending family gatherings again, allowing relatives to introduce him to women. Many were polite but distant. Some looked at Tolani with indifference, others with barely concealed resentment. Then he met Oluwapelumi. She was calm, soft-spoken, and respectful. She greeted Tolani with a smile that seemed genuine, kneeling to her level. "Good afternoon, my daughter," she said warmly. Tolani stared at her, surprised. During subsequent visits, Oluwapelumi brought snacks for Tolani, asked about her school, praised her drawings. She listened patiently as Mr. Adebayo spoke about his late wife, never showing jealousy or discomfort. "I understand what it means to step into a broken home," she once said gently. "I have a big heart. I can love her like my own." Those words settled like balm on Mr. Adebayo's wounded soul. Family members approved. The church elders encouraged him. Even Mama Saad nodded cautiously. "She seems kind," she admitted. "But watch carefully." Mr. Adebayo ignored the warning, not out of pride, but out of hope. He believed he had found the answer to his prayers. A woman who would fill the silence in the house. A mother who would guide Tolani into womanhood. A partner who would share the burden of life. As the wedding date approached, Tolani clung to her father one night and asked softly, "Daddy, will she love me?" He held her close. "Yes, my dear, everything will be better now." But fate had already begun writing a different story. For 8 precious months, Tolani lived in what felt like a miracle. The house that once echoed with silence now carried the rhythm of routine and warmth. Each morning began with the sound of Mrs. Oluwapelumi humming softly as she cooked. The smell of fresh pap or fried akara drifted through the rooms, pulling Tolani from sleep with a smile already forming on her lips. "Wake up, my dear," Mrs. Oluwapelumi would call. "School will not wait for you." Tolani would rush out, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and find her uniform neatly folded. Her hair was washed, combed, and carefully plaited. For the first time, she walked to school feeling like other children, clean, confident, and complete. At school, teachers noticed the change. "You are looking brighter, Tolani," one of them said. Tolani smiled shyly, proud but unsure why. After school, she returned to a home that felt safe. Food was warm, questions were asked. Laughter came easily. Mrs. Oluwapelumi corrected her homework patiently, praising her when she did well and guiding her when she struggled. "Take your time," she would say. "You are intelligent." Those words planted something powerful in Tolani's heart. Belief. On weekends, Mrs. Oluwapelumi took her along to the market. She held her hand tightly in crowded places, protecting her. Sometimes she bought her small treats. Ground nuts wrapped in newspaper, a sweet biscuit, a colorful hair ribbon. "These things matter," she once said to a neighbor. "Children remember how you make them feel." Mr. Adebayo watched with gratitude. He felt lighter, less burdened. He came home earlier, more relaxed, believing his family was finally whole. At night, he and his wife spoke softly about the future, about saving money, about Tolani's education, about building a better life. Tolani often listened from her corner, her heart swelling with hope. She began to call Mrs. Oluwapelumi Mama without fear. The word felt natural now, no longer heavy on her tongue. She clung to her at gatherings, proudly introducing her to friends. "This is my mama," she would say. Mrs. Oluwapelumi smiled in response, though sometimes her eyes lingered elsewhere, thoughtful and distant. Church became a family affair. Tolani sat between her father and stepmother, singing loudly. People admired them. "God has restored your home," they told Mr. Adebayo. He believed them. But even in this season of joy, tiny cracks began to form, almost invisible. Mrs. Oluwapelumi corrected Tolani more often than before. Her tone occasionally sharpened. Sometimes she sighed when Tolani asked too many questions. Once, when Tolani accidentally spilled soup, Mrs. Oluwapelumi scolded her sharply before quickly softening her voice when Mr. Adebayo entered the room. "Be careful next time," she said sweetly. Tolani noticed the difference, though she did not understand it. Still, she clung to the happiness. She prayed every night that nothing would change, that this love would stay forever. But life had already begun to shift. As the 8th month approached, Mrs. Oluwapelumi began complaining of nausea and dizziness. Visits to the clinic confirmed it. She was pregnant. The house buzzed with excitement. Tolani smiled, happy for her mama, unaware that this pregnancy would quietly mark the end of her false heaven. The love she knew was about to be tested, and it would not survive. For now, Tolani slept peacefully. The day Mrs. Oluwapelumi went into labor, the house buzzed with nervous excitement. Neighbors gathered, whispering prayers and advice. Mr. Adebayo paced the compound just as he had done years earlier when Tolani was born, though this time hope outweighed fear. Tolani sat quietly on a wooden stool near the door, watching everything unfold. No one noticed how tightly she clutched her hands together or how her eyes followed every movement of her stepmother. "Daddy?" she asked softly. "Will Mama be okay?" "Yes, my dear," he replied, forcing a smile. "She'll be fine." When the cry of the newborn finally filled the air, joy erupted. Ululations echoed through the compound. The baby, a healthy boy, was welcomed with celebration, laughter, and thanksgiving. Mrs. Oluwapelumi returned home days later, glowing with pride, the baby wrapped snugly in soft cloth. Visitors poured in with gifts. Food was cooked in abundance. Songs of gratitude filled the house. Tolani stood in a corner watching. At first she was curious and excited. She peeped into the baby's face, smiling. "He's small," she said. "Can I carry him?" Mrs. Oluwapelumi hesitated, then replied curtly, "No, go and sit down." "You might drop him." The words stung. From that moment, something shifted. Mrs. Oluwapelumi's attention became fixed entirely on her child. Her patience grew thin. Her smiles toward Tolani faded. When the baby cried, every inconvenience was blamed on Tolani. "You made noise, that's why he woke up." "Why are you standing there uselessly? Bring water." Tolani began to feel invisible, except when she was needed for errands. Mr. Adebayo noticed small changes, but dismissed them as stress. She just gave birth, he told himself. She's tired, but the distance widened quickly. Meals changed. Tolani was served last. Sometimes she was forgotten entirely. When she reminded Mrs. Oluwapelumi, she was scolded. "Are you the only one in this house?" At night, Tolani listened from her sleeping mat as her stepmother sang lullabies to the baby, songs she used to sing to her too. Tears soaked her pillow as she hugged her doll tightly. One afternoon, Tolani mistakenly broke a cup while washing dishes. The sound drew Mrs. Oluwapelumi running. "Stupid girl," she shouted, raising her hand. Mr. Adebayo stepped in just in time. "Enough," he said calmly. "She didn't do it on purpose." Mrs. Oluwapelumi fell silent, her face tight with anger, but the message was clear. From that day on, the hostility became quiet, calculated. No more open affection, no more gentle words, only commands and cold glances. Tolani tried harder, she cleaned better. She spoke less. She smiled even when her heart hurt. But nothing was ever enough. The birth of the first child had changed the balance of love in the house. Tolani was no longer the child who needed care. She had become a burden, a reminder of a past Mrs. Oluwapelumi no longer wished to acknowledge. And though Tolani did not yet understand it fully, her place in the family had begun to disappear the moment the baby took his first breath. The change did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, like poison seeping into water, quiet, unnoticed at first until everything tasted bitter. After the birth of the baby, Mrs. Oluwapelumi's kindness toward Tolani did not merely fade, it curdled. The warmth in her voice was replaced by sharpness. Her smiles became rare, and when they appeared, they never reached her eyes. Tolani felt it in the way she was called, not by her name anymore, but by commands. "Come here. Do this. Get out of my sight." Each word stripped away a piece of the love Tolani once believed was real. Morning routines changed. Where Mrs. Oluwapelumi once woke her gently, she now kicked the mat with her foot. "Wake up! Do you want the whole house to scatter?" Tolani rose before dawn, her small body still heavy with sleep. She swept the compound, washed dishes, and fetched water before school. When she returned tired and hungry, there was no concern, only more instructions. "You didn't wash the plates properly. Why is the floor still dirty?" Nothing she did was right. Mrs. Oluwapelumi began comparing her openly to her biological child. "See my son, quiet, obedient. Unlike you, stubborn child." Tolani learned to lower her head and stay silent. Speaking back only invited punishment. Sometimes Mrs. Oluwapelumi would deliberately show affection to her own child in front of Tolani, kissing him, laughing loudly, then turn cold the moment Tolani drew near. "Go away," she would snap. "You disturb me." At night, Tolani lay awake, replaying memories of the first 8 months. She wondered what she had done wrong. She searched her heart for answers that never came. Mr. Adebayo noticed the tension but avoided confrontation. When he was present, Mrs. Oluwapelumi softened her tone, performing kindness like an act. When he left, the cruelty returned twice as strong. Once, a neighbor asked Mrs. Oluwapelumi why Tolani looked so thin. "Children grow differently," she replied dismissively. "She eats too much anyway." Tolani's meals were often delayed or reduced. Leftovers became her portion. Sometimes she went to bed hungry, listening to her siblings cry less because their needs were always met. Hatred soon replaced indifference. Mrs. Oluwapelumi began calling her names: lazy, useless, ungrateful. Each insult landed heavily, carving scars that no one could see. One evening, Tolani accidentally fell while carrying water and spilled some on the floor. Mrs. Oluwapelumi's anger exploded. "Do you want to kill my child with your foolishness?" she screamed, slapping Tolani across the face. The sound echoed through the house. Tolani did not cry. She only stared at the floor, shame burning hotter than pain. That night, she whispered to God, "Please, make her love me again." But love had already turned into something cruel and unrecognizable. Mrs. Oluwapelumi no longer saw Tolani as a child. She saw her as competition, as excess, as a reminder of a life before her own children existed. And in that house, where Tolani once felt safe, hatred had officially taken root, growing stronger with every passing day. By the time Tolani reached her early teens, her life had transformed entirely. The house that once held warmth and laughter had become a prison, and she was no longer a daughter in her own home. Every room reminded her of her place: the quiet corners for the children, the warm beds for her siblings, the soft chairs for her stepmother, and a thin, worn mat by the kitchen wall for herself. Her mornings began before the sun even considered rising. She would rise silently, careful not to wake anyone else, and start sweeping the compound. The dust and leaves seemed endless, carried by the wind as if mocking her efforts. After that, she would fetch water from the well, a journey made more difficult by her small frame struggling with the heavy buckets. Breakfast was rarely for her. Sometimes she would only have scraps left over after her stepmother and siblings had eaten. She learned to eat quickly and quietly, lest she draw attention or criticism. The day's work stretched endlessly. Washing clothes, cooking meals, cleaning floors, tending to the children, running errands, each task piled on top of the other. Sometimes she had to cook in the scorching heat of the midday sun, her back bent over steaming pots, her hands raw from scrubbing. When she made a mistake, even the smallest one, Mrs. Oluwapelumi's sharp tongue did not spare her. "You are useless. Do you think this house runs itself?" she shouted one day after Tolani accidentally broke an egg while preparing breakfast. The crack of the eggshell on the floor felt louder than her words. Tolani lowered her head, swallowing the sting of humiliation, knowing better than to argue. Even her attempts at friendship were denied. Other children in the neighborhood sometimes came to play, but they left quickly once they saw her working tirelessly while they were free to laugh and run. She became invisible to the outside world, a shadow that existed only to serve the family she had once belonged to. School, once a place of hope, became a distant memory. Some days she skipped lessons entirely, forced to finish chores before she could even think about leaving. Her books, when she managed to open them, were dusty, the pages folded and worn from neglect. Learning was no longer a joy. It was a burden, something she squeezed into the margins of her life after the work was done. Even her father, Mr. Adebayo, became a silent observer. He returned from work late in the evenings, tired and preoccupied, noticing only the outward order of the household. He failed to see the bruises that sometimes marked Tolani's hands or the exhaustion in her eyes. When he tried to intervene, Mrs. Oluwapelumi's outward charm returned, her voice soft and controlled, making him believe she was strict but fair. Her siblings, young as they were, learned to treat her as their servant. They did not understand cruelty. They only copied what they saw. "Tolani, carry my bag," one would demand. "Clean my plate!" another would shout. Tolani obeyed, her small body bending to every command. Resistance was met with anger, sometimes words, sometimes physical punishment. She began to shrink into herself. "Please," she whispered. "Please make it stop. Please let someone see me. Please let Daddy love me like before." The walls of the house, once filled with laughter, now echoed with her unspoken suffering. Tolani's body grew thin, her hair unkempt despite the work she did to keep it neat, her skin dry and rough from endless labor. She became a ghost in her own home, a daughter in name only. The people outside the house saw a girl who worked hard, who obeyed, who smiled when smiled at. But inside, Tolani's heart was breaking quietly, piece by piece, under the relentless weight of cruelty and neglect. And yet, despite everything, a small ember of hope remained inside her, a belief that maybe one day someone would see her, someone would care, and that the life she had lost might be restored in some small way. But that ember flickered in the shadows, struggling against the storm of suffering that had become her every day. By now, Tolani was no longer a child in her father's house. She was a servant, a shadow, a silent figure whose existence was tolerated only as long as it was useful. Her childhood, once bright with the possibility of love, had been stripped away, replaced by a harsh reality she could neither escape nor change. It was in this chapter of her life, when innocence met cruelty, that the seeds of her suffering would grow deepest, setting the stage for the illness, neglect, and tragedy that was yet to come. Mr. Adebayo had changed as much as the house had. The vibrant man who had once held his daughter with tenderness now walked with hunched shoulders and weary eyes. The weight of responsibility pressed on him constantly, not just for the house, not just for the children, but for the fractured family he no longer knew how to protect. He had watched, often silently, as Tolani's place in the home diminished. He had noticed the way her hands were calloused from endless work, the way her small frame seemed perpetually bent under invisible burdens, the way her eyes, once bright with laughter, now flickered with exhaustion and caution. But he did nothing. It was not that he didn't care. He did. Every beat of his heart throbbed with guilt for the suffering of his daughter. Yet, every time he tried to intervene, he was met with the polished politeness of Mrs. Oluwapelumi. Her sweetness returned whenever he appeared, her words carefully measured to appear reasonable. "She's only being strict," she would say softly, glancing at him with calm, convincing eyes. "I am teaching her discipline. You should be grateful she listens at all." And Mr. Adebayo, too tired, too conflicted, too afraid to challenge the woman he had married, nodded in agreement. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe he had made the right decision. But in the quiet moments, when no one else was watching, the guilt gnawed at him. "Why did I bring this upon her?" he would whisper in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as the house slept. "I wanted to give her a mother, and yet I've left her alone in the worst possible way." Tolani learned to hide her pain from him. She tried to catch his eyes during the rare moments he came home early, hoping for a flicker of understanding. But he rarely looked at her. He was tired, distracted, burdened with work and responsibilities. The conversations they once had were now replaced with brief instructions or hurried questions about school, homework, or chores. Did you sweep the compound? Did you cook the food? Did you feed the children? Each question, though seemingly benign, carried the weight of expectation and judgment. The love she had once sought from him became entwined with guilt and silence. She no longer dared to ask for comfort or attention, fearing she would only burden him more. Neighbors noticed, too. They whispered about the girl's changing appearance, the exhaustion in her gait, the quietness that had replaced her once playful laughter. They tried to caution Mr. Adebayo gently. "You should see how thin she's become," one neighbor said cautiously. "She looks like she hasn't eaten properly in days." "I am aware," he replied softly, his eyes avoiding theirs. "Everything is under control." But it was not under control. Even in church, where he once prayed openly for his daughter's well-being, Mr. Adebayo found his prayers faltering. He watched Tolani from the pew, standing tall for others but bowed under the weight of invisible burdens. His heart ached as he remembered the vibrant child she had been, the laughter they had shared when the house was lighter, the mornings when he had held her tiny hand to guide her through simple joys. And yet he remained silent. He feared confrontation with Mrs. Oluwapelumi. He feared disrupting the fragile peace in the house that kept his stepchildren content and his wife outwardly happy. He feared making mistakes, though he had already made the greatest one by failing to protect Tolani from neglect. So he watched, he nodded. He agreed. He remained a silent observer as the girl he had vowed to protect became a shadow of herself. Tolani noticed his silence. She began to interpret it as abandonment. "Daddy doesn't love me anymore," she whispered to herself one night, curled on her thin mat beside the kitchen. "He only sees what he wants to see. He doesn't care." The quiet, the inaction, the lack of protection, the absence of a father's voice in her suffering left deep scars on Tolani's heart. The home that should have been her sanctuary became a place of labor, fear, and sorrow. Even small moments of hope, like a kind glance from her father, were fleeting and rare. Most of the time, his presence reminded her of how powerless she truly was. The man who had once promised to protect her from the world now seemed like a silent witness to her pain, a figure whose love was trapped behind fear and indecision. And so, day by day, Tolani learned to exist quietly, to obey, to serve, and to hide her hurt, while her father remained a silent sentinel, a man unable to intervene, powerless against the storm of cruelty his own family had brought into the life of his daughter. The house was full of people, yet Tolani had never felt more alone. It was in this silence, her father's silence, the house's silence, that the seeds of Tolani's despair were sown. By the time Tolani was approaching her mid-teens, the relentless labor and emotional neglect began to take a tangible toll on her body. Every movement brought with it an ache she had long grown accustomed to, but had no words to describe. Her limbs were sore from constant sweeping, washing, cooking, and carrying water. Her back ached from hours bent over the laundry, scrubbing clothes until her hands bled. It started subtly at first. A dull pain in her lower back, a lingering ache in her sides, and frequent bouts of fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Tolani ignored the discomfort, pushing herself harder, convincing herself that the pain was simply part of life, part of the chores she had been born into. But her body was slowly giving warning signs, a silent alarm that grew louder with each passing day. One evening, after hours of washing clothes under the hot evening sun, she leaned against the wall, clutching her side. Her breath came in shallow, shaky gasps. "Mama," she whispered softly, "it hurts here." Mrs. Oluwapelumi, busy tending to her youngest child, barely looked up. "Stop making excuses. You are just tired," she said, her voice sharp. "Finish what you were doing." "No one wants to hear whining." Tolani swallowed her cries. She could not afford to argue. She knew that any complaint would be met with punishment, whether verbal or physical. So she bit her lip, straightened her aching back, and returned to work, praying that the pain would subside if she ignored it. Over the next few weeks, the discomfort worsened. Sometimes she would stumble while carrying water, feeling lightheaded and dizzy, but she pushed herself forward. Her stepmother's words haunted her. "You are useless if you cannot work." The fear of being scolded, punished, or ridiculed kept her silent. At school, Tolani struggled. Her concentration waned. She could not focus on lessons, could not raise her hand in class, and often fell asleep at her desk, exhausted from early morning chores. Her teachers noticed the change. "Tolani, are you feeling unwell?" one teacher asked gently during a morning lesson. Tolani shook her head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Ma." She didn't have the courage, or the words, to explain that she was in pain every single day. Pain that was growing deeper, sharper, yet invisible to everyone. One afternoon, while washing dishes, Tolani doubled over in agony, tears streaming down her face. She could no longer pretend it was mere fatigue. She leaned against the wall, pressing her hands against her stomach, the sharp pangs slicing through her chest and side. Mrs. Oluwapelumi entered, carrying laundry, and caught sight of her daughter-in-law's daughter. "What's wrong with you now?" she barked. "Are you pretending again?" Tolani shook her head weakly. "It hurts. Mama, please." Mrs. Oluwapelumi's expression hardened. "Pain? You think you're the only one who has work to do? Stop being dramatic. Go back to work." Tolani obeyed silently, her heart breaking with each step. That night, as she lay on her thin mat, she whispered prayers into the darkness. "God, if you can hear me, please, let the pain go away. Let me not be punished for hurting." But the pain did not fade. The following weeks brought more signs: swelling in her legs, difficulty sleeping, and fatigue that left her gasping after even minor exertion. Her body was telling her that something was wrong, something serious. She tried to tell her father one evening, hoping that maybe he would intervene. "Daddy, my body hurts a lot. I feel weak." Mr. Adebayo looked at her, his eyes weary and distant. "You are just tired, Tolani. Get some rest tonight and work harder tomorrow." Those words, though gentle in tone, carried the weight of indifference. Tolani's pleas were met with dismissal, leaving her feeling abandoned by the one person who might have protected her. In secret, she began to dread her days. The chores she had once completed with quiet resilience became mountains she could barely climb. Even small tasks exhausted her. Yet there was no relief, no reprieve, no compassion. By now, her body was a battlefield. Every movement brought sharp reminders that something was deeply wrong. But Tolani had no means to seek help, no authority to intervene, and no one who believed her cries. And so the pain grew, silently and insidiously, deep into her bones and organs, unnoticed by the world. Her life had already been reduced to survival, and now survival itself had begun to betray her. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The physical pain was a herald of the disease that would soon consume her, one that might have been treated had someone, anyone, chosen to listen. Mr. Adebayo made the occasional half-hearted attempt to intervene, buying medicine here, asking the nurse questions there, but the effort was never sustained. Mrs. Oluwapelumi subtly undermined every plan. She complained that treatment was too expensive, that Tolani was too weak to attend the clinic on her own, that the children needed more care than the father could provide if he focused on Tolani. Tolani understood the reality before her father did. Her stepmother did not care. Her life, her suffering, her very being were unimportant. She retreated into silence, hiding the depths of her pain. At night, curled on her thin mat, she whispered prayers that God would somehow heal her, even if no one else could. "Please," she whispered. "I am tired. I am scared. Don't let me die." The disease, however, did not wait. It silently advanced, attacking her kidneys, her strength, her body. Every day became a battle just to exist, to fulfill chores, to survive the cruelty of the home she could not escape. By the time she could have hoped for treatment, the delay, neglect, and indifference had already begun to take their toll. Tolani, once a lively, hopeful child, was now trapped in a body betraying her, in a house that did not see her, and under the care of people who refused to fight for her life. And so, in this chapter of her life, the months following Tolani's diagnosis became a slow, cruel unraveling of her life. The reality of her illness, the relentlessness of her household, and the cold indifference of her stepmother turned each day into a battle for mere survival. Tolani's 14th birthday didn't come with any luck. Her body had grown weaker. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her once nimble hands now trembled from exhaustion. Simple tasks, like carrying water or stirring a pot, left her winded. Every movement brought sharp pains in her sides, back, and joints. She tried to rest, but rest was a luxury she was no longer allowed. Mrs. Oluwapelumi's attitude toward her grew colder with each passing day. The moment Tolani faltered in her chores, she was met with anger, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. "You are slow! Look at your sister, she never complains," she snapped one morning, pointing at the youngest child who giggled at a toy in her arms. Tolani lowered her head silently, continuing her work with shaking hands. Complaining brought no sympathy, it brought punishment. Despite the severity of her condition, medical treatment was sporadic at best. Mr. Adebayo tried in small ways to provide care, buying medicine, taking her to the clinic, but the effort was undermined at every turn. Mrs. Oluwapelumi would scold Tolani for being dramatic or insist that he focus on the children. "You worry too much," she would say. "She's fine, stop spoiling her." Tolani began to understand that her suffering was invisible in the household. Her cries were unheard, her pain dismissed. Her illness was considered inconvenient rather than dangerous. School became impossible. Tolani could no longer attend regularly. The few days she did manage to go were filled with faintness and exhaustion. Teachers expressed concern, but Tolani had learned not to tell anyone the truth. Speaking out invited criticism, not help. During those 8 months, the disease gnawed at her slowly. Fatigue became constant. Her appetite disappeared. Nausea was an everyday companion. She could no longer sleep well, and even resting on her thin mat offered little relief. Neighbors occasionally commented on her state, but Mrs. Oluwapelumi always provided a swift explanation to maintain appearances. "She's just lazy," she would claim. 8 months, God. 8 months and still no one sees me. Please, help me." The disease had taken root, attacking her kidneys relentlessly, while neglect and overwork compounded its effects. Every day became an ordeal, a fight to rise, a fight to move, a fight to keep breathing in a household that had stopped caring. Tolani's suffering during these 8 months was not only physical but emotional. She felt invisible, unwanted, and unloved in the home that should have been her sanctuary. Her stepmother's indifference was like a constant shadow over her, and her father's silence became a reminder that even those who should protect her could fail. By the end of the 8th month, her body had grown frail, her spirit weary. The neglect that had started as emotional and psychological cruelty had now escalated into a matter of life and death. Tolani's small frame bore the marks of suffering, while the disease advanced silently, devouring her from within. And in those dark, quiet moments, as she lay weak and trembling, Tolani understood the cruel truth. She was alone in a house full of people, fighting a battle that no one else seemed willing to see or fight for her. Her life, once full of hope and potential, had been reduced to silent endurance as each passing day brought her closer to the inevitable. By the time Tolani had endured nearly a year under her stepmother's cruelty, her body had begun to betray her in ways she could no longer ignore. The relentless chores, combined with the gnawing pain of kidney disease and malnutrition, had left her frail and weak. Each day was a trial, each movement an effort, each breath a reminder of her suffering. Her mornings began before dawn, as always. She rose from her thin mat, shivering from the cold, her body stiff and swollen in places. Every joint protested as she carried water from the well. Each step was painstaking, yet the house demanded her attention. The younger children needed breakfast, the laundry had to be done, the floors swept, and every corner of the compound polished. "Tolani, hurry up!" Mrs. Oluwapelumi would call sharply from the kitchen. "Do you want this house to fall apart while you laze around?" Tolani obeyed silently, biting her lips to keep the groans from escaping. Her body ached from the previous day, but the work never stopped, and no one offered relief. By mid-morning, the nausea hit her harder than ever. She tried to eat the meager portions provided, but most food turned to acid in her stomach. Sometimes she had no choice but to swallow it, fearing the scolding that would come if she refused. At school, her condition had deteriorated. Even when she managed to attend, she could not concentrate. Fatigue weighed down her mind. Lessons blurred before her eyes. Classmates noticed her thinness, her frequent absences, her pale complexion. Some whispered words of concern, but Tolani smiled weakly, hiding her pain. The doctor's words echoed in her mind constantly. If left untreated, her condition could be fatal. But treatment had been inconsistent. Money for medication was rarely forthcoming, and Mrs. Oluwapelumi's cold indifference meant that Tolani's needs were always secondary to the comfort of her own children. Tolani's father tried in his own way to help. Sometimes he would ask her to rest, buy medicine, or take her to the clinic. But his interventions were fleeting. He could not confront Mrs. Oluwapelumi fully, and his fatigue from work prevented him from maintaining consistent care. The cruelty of her stepmother had become surgical in precision. Tolani was no longer just neglected. She was actively marginalized in every aspect of the household. "Go carry water for your sister," Mrs. Oluwapelumi barked one afternoon. "And be quick this time." Tolani's legs shook as she obeyed. She could barely lift the bucket, but fear propelled her forward. The youngest child giggled beside her, oblivious to Tolani's struggle, while her stepmother's sharp eyes watched for the slightest sign of slowness or weakness. Even small mistakes were met with anger. One evening, while preparing the children's dinner, Tolani accidentally spilled a small amount of soup. Mrs. Oluwapelumi's voice rang through the house like a whip. "You are useless. Do you want to kill my children with your carelessness?" Tolani lowered her head silently, swallowing the sting of humiliation and pain. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. Sometimes she imagined her mother, the woman she had never known, the warmth she had only heard about in stories from neighbors and distant relatives. She wondered if her mother had dreamed of a life like this for her, one filled with love, care, and freedom. But those dreams were distant, impossible to reach in a home dominated by cruelty and neglect. By now, her stepmother's hatred had become routine. Tolani was no longer treated as a member of the family. She was a servant, invisible unless her labor was required. Every smile, every kind word from the past had vanished. Laughter, once possible, was now a memory. Tolani began to withdraw further, speaking less, moving quietly, hiding her pain as best she could. Her classmates noticed her absence, the changes in her appearance, but she would only smile weakly, hiding the depth of her suffering. Her father watched with growing guilt and helplessness. He could see the girl he had once promised to protect being slowly destroyed by illness and neglect. Yet, his fear of conflict and the overwhelming responsibilities of the household prevented him from fully acting. And so the days merged into one another: pain, chores, exhaustion, neglect, and sorrow. Each passing day brought her closer to the brink. Her body weakened, her spirit dimmed, and her small heart bore the weight of relentless suffering. By the 8th month of her decline, Tolani could barely stand without support. Her body was a map of her pain, each ache a marker of the cruelty she endured, each bruise a testament to the indifference of those around her. The disease that had begun silently now roared within her, consuming her strength, her health. Tolani's body was now frail and fragile, her once energetic frame diminished by relentless labor, cruelty, and the disease eating away at her kidneys. Every day was a fight, a struggle to complete chores, to survive, to breathe through the pain that had become her constant companion. Yet she continued to obey, to serve, and to hide her suffering, knowing that complaints would bring anger, not compassion. Each morning, before the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, she rose from her thin mat, shivering as the cold bit through her weakening body. Her limbs ached, her back protested every movement, and nausea churned in her stomach, yet she pushed herself to fetch water, sweep the compound, and prepare meals for her stepmother's children. "Tolani, stop standing there daydreaming. Do your work," Mrs. Oluwapelumi snapped one morning, her voice sharp and unforgiving. Tolani's hands trembled as she obeyed, spilling a drop of water in her haste. Her stepmother's sharp gaze fell upon her instantly. "You are careless. You want to kill us all with your foolishness?" she shouted. Tolani lowered her head silently, swallowing the pain, physical and emotional alike. There was no room for complaints, only endless obedience. Her father watched from a distance, guilt weighing heavily on his heart. He wanted to intervene, to take her to the hospital, to fight for her life. But the fear of conflict with Mrs. Oluwapelumi, combined with years of resignation, kept him silent. His words of concern were few and fleeting. "Eat something, Tolani. Rest if you can." But these small gestures could not undo months of neglect. Tolani had become a shadow, a child whose life depended on the care of people who had chosen cruelty over compassion. The disease that had taken root months earlier now progressed rapidly. Her legs swelled painfully, her back throbbed incessantly, and fatigue left her gasping after even minor exertions. Nights were sleepless. She curled on her thin mat, silently praying for relief, for strength, for a sign that someone noticed her suffering. One evening, after carrying a heavy bucket of water, Tolani collapsed near the door. Her body trembled violently, her chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. Mrs. Oluwapelumi's sharp voice cut through the air. "What is wrong with you now? Are you pretending to be sick?" Tolani tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could only shake her head, too weak to defend herself, too exhausted to protest. Mr. Adebayo knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he lifted her gently. "Tolani, please, we must go to the clinic." "You can't stay like this." Mrs. Oluwapelumi's expression hardened. "The clinic? You are wasting time. She is exaggerating. Look at her, she is fine." Tolani's small, frail body rested against her father as he carried her, tears streaming silently down her face. She felt the truth deep in her bones. No one would truly fight for her. No one would see the depth of her suffering except God. At the clinic, the doctors were gravely concerned. Her vitals were weak, her kidneys failing rapidly. Dialysis was urgently recommended, but even the knowledge of what needed to be done did not guarantee that it would happen. The reality of her situation, neglect, limited resources, and stepmotherly indifference, was crushing. "Your daughter needs immediate care," the doctor said. Any delay could be fatal. The journey back home was silent. Tolani rested in her father's arms, her head heavy, her body trembling, and her breath shallow. She whispered prayers she barely remembered learning in church, pleading with God for mercy, for relief, for life. Back at home, her stepmother remained indifferent. Tolani's cries of pain were ignored, her pleas for comfort brushed aside. Even the youngest children, who had once looked to her for guidance and care, now played obliviously, unaware of the gravity of her condition. Days passed in a blur of suffering. Tolani's strength diminished further. She could no longer complete chores alone. Simple tasks like fetching water or sweeping left her trembling. Her father attempted to help, but it was never enough. The household continued, relentless, indifferent to the girl slowly slipping from life. Tolani spent her nights in pain, curling up on the thin mat, whispering her final prayers. "God, please. I am tired. I am scared. Don't let me die. Please." Her body weakened day by day, her frailty evident to anyone who saw her. The disease had advanced beyond the point where simple remedies could help. Each day brought a closer confrontation with the reality that she might not survive. In her last weeks, Tolani drifted between brief moments of awareness and long stretches of exhaustion. Her mind wandered to memories of the fleeting love she had known, the rare moments when her stepmother had been kind, and the early childhood she had lost. She imagined her mother's smile, a warmth she had never truly known but clung to in her heart. Yet reality was unforgiving. Her stepmother's hatred, her father's silence, and the neglect she had endured compounded the disease, leaving her trapped in a body that could no longer fight. Tolani's final struggle was quiet, private, and lonely. The house that should have been her sanctuary was a prison, the people around her indifferent to the young life slipping away. And in those final moments, curled on her thin mat, Tolani's suffering ended not with relief or comfort, but in the stark shadow of neglect and abandonment, a cruel testament to the years of cruelty, labor, and illness she had endured. Her passing was quiet, almost unnoticed, except by the few who might later remember her as a fragile child who had once carried a spark of hope in her heart, extinguished too soon by circumstances she had no power to change. Tolani's death marked the culmination of neglect, cruelty, and indifference, a young life taken far too early, a reminder of the consequences of a household where love was conditional and protection was absent. On the day of Tolani's burial, her stepmom, who showed her nothing but pure wickedness, was seen crying and rolling on the floor. People around who knew how mean she has been to Tolani couldn't understand where the sudden emotional drama was coming from. Tolani was wrapped in a white cloth and placed inside a small coffin.